So this is the first time that Yasmin David's work has been exhibited, and we have been trying to explore the reasons why this might be. And that's really what her daughter Cleo has been piecing together over this last decade. So she's been discovering her mother's work and having this ongoing personal connection. And she's obviously so sorry not to be here today, and was really looking forward to sharing these insights with you. But we will definitely work with something Cleo in the future. So with that in mind, so as I said, I'm sort of filling in the gaps with Cleo today, and was doing this at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then it was just, so the starting point is I was up late as a combination of having little children that are high maintenance and don't sleep, and preparing for this conference today. And my partner works full time and has a proper 9-to-5 job. So there's very little understanding of the nature of my work. So then that, it just occurred to me that this is exactly kind of what we are talking about. So to kick off, I was thinking of the traditional role of women in society still being alive and well, despite it being the 21st century. So we've had the recent Freelands report and a lot of investigation into this impact of lockdown that women have had the burden of childcare. And then the quote, the Cyril Connolly much quoted line, it came into my head about the pram in the hall being the enemy of art, which I sort of hate. But then I realised that Cyril Connolly was part of the Garmin friendship group. It is derived, I think, from his excuses as to why he wasn't able to live up to his expectations. But he, in fact, is the father of Cressida Connolly, who wrote The Rare and the Beautiful, the biography of the Garmins, and he was friends of the Garmins. So it did seem apt to kind of kick that off as the first provocation. So I'm interested in the relationship between art and family. Really successful artists who I admire, like Sandra Blow, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, Tracy Emin. So she famously stated she couldn't be both a successful artist and a mother. And the idea of do you have to be childless to be successful? So what do we think about that? And do you guys have any thoughts or comparisons with that? Because the first thing that Cleo said in the film is that she devoted her life to her family. She raised the children. It was a patriarchal society, and that's what women did. And so that her painting was just private for her, and she couldn't, have a career. So what do we think about that? And I might kick off with Naomi, because we had a quick discussion about artists such as Rose Wiley, who we're both a massive fan of, and features in your collection. And she is someone who has become successful later in life. She had a family, she was married to an artist, but the art, maybe, do you feel, had to take a back seat? And do women have to be old or dead to get recognition kind of for their work now? And also in linking with Isabel in your collection, Isabel Rossthorn, yeah. She's connected with us. She was the mother of Epstein's youngest son. She abandoned him, sorry. And then kind of basically, went off and did her art. So can you be both? What do you think about that, Naomi?
Yeah, well, I think it's an absolutely fascinating question, and working in an all-women's art collection, it's something that I think about a lot and is confronted a lot in the artist's work, and also in what they say about their lives and careers. So I'm back here as an assistant curator, but actually was working here as art assistant a couple of years ago, covering for the curator's previous maternity leave, which also brings up questions of motherhood and women in the workplace and stepping in for one another and things. But so I sort of have a decently good knowledge of the collection and have met some of the artists. And one of the artists who came to visit, who's in our collection, is Erin Lawler, who's an amazing abstract painter. And I was showing her around, and I mentioned that we had a couple of Tracy Emin works, and she visibly bristled and said, I think Tracy Emin has been incredibly unhelpful to women artists by saying that you can't be a mother and an artist. And she was there with her daughter, so clearly she doesn't share Emin's approach to it. And Emin, has been very open about having multiple abortions and has made work about it, and has said that if she did have children, she wouldn't have been able to continue her art practice. And certainly that is the experience of a lot of women. Barbara Hepworth, for example, had triplets, but they were largely brought up by, well, they were sent to a nursery, and she carried on focusing on her practice rather than necessarily being that involved in her children's upbringing. Similarly, Celia Pools, who's another artist in our collection, she had a child with Lucian Freud called Frank, named after Frank Albach, and again her mother raised Frank, so she wasn't particularly involved in raising her child. But on the other hand, there are artists who have become mothers and have continued with their practice. So we have one artist in the collection, Charlotte Hodes, who's a kind of multidisciplinary artist, and she's had several children and deals with themes of motherhood in her work. And she actually said that being part of the New Hall Art Collection, which has, you know, so many women artists represented in it, made her feel part of a network. And after she gave birth, she felt emboldened to go back to the studio and kind of make that step back towards her practice. And Isabel Rawsthorne is an absolutely fascinating character. I'm glad that you mentioned her. We have a couple of works by her, and actually I was lucky enough during my master's, along with Jane, to work with Carol Jacobi at Tate Britain, who has just written a very extensive and carefully researched monograph on Isabel. And I call her Isabel not as a sexist thing of calling women by their first names, but because she actually had 4 different last names during her life, because she was married 3 times. And so it's incredible. One of the questions is what to call her in exhibitions. Her maiden name was Isabel Lambert, but in most of her exhibitions during her lifetime, she was called Isabel Rawsthorne, which is the name of her final husband, Alan Rawsthorne. But it's a big question of what to call her. And she, as you said, she conceived a child with Jacob Epstein while she was working as a studio assistant for him. And he and his wife, Margaret, were unable to conceive. And so when she found out that she was pregnant, aged 18 or 19, she decided that instead of bringing up her child, she would leave it to the Epsteins. And she went to Paris and then became part of a very vibrant artistic circle, which included Giacometti and Picasso. And she, I don't think, ever saw her son during her life, but a lot of her works, she painted a lot of animals, and there's a whole series of works of monkeys, baboons, and a lot of them are of a mother baboon and a child baboon. And when you know the story of her life, it's incredibly touching and sort of haunting. And obviously there's a whole question about how much biographical detail we should talk about in relation to women artists, because often there's a lot of biography that's not necessarily relevant, and you know, the question of whether an artist is a mother becomes quite central to the artist's identity. But certainly it does colour those works in a very sort of heartrending light.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of the baboon works. I'll have to look at them, but I know that Jackie didn't discover that Isabel was his mother until he was in his 60s. So yeah, at a Henry Moore exhibition, I believe, someone dropped that clanger. How does that relate to Marion, I wonder? Lucy, do we know much about her biography in terms of...
Yeah, we do now. I should say that when we embarked on the exhibition that we did in 2017, the first hurdle was trying to get together as much information as we could about her work. So she was featured in the Angels of Anarchy exhibition back in 2009 at Manchester Art Gallery at the time. But if you look in that catalogue, she's brilliantly represented by imagery, but in terms of biographical information, it's incredibly scant, and that's because pretty much her entire estate was left to a friend when she died, and it was very lovingly cared for, but it wasn't really promoted in any way. So it was all sort of locked up very neatly in Derbyshire. So we went in, and the first job, really a bit like with Yasmin's work, was to try and make sense of this, and this incredible body of work that we suddenly found ourselves presented with, you know, the likes which we'd never seen before. We knew Marion for a particular type of painting, particularly paper ladies, which she's quite well known for now. But there was this whole other sort of range of work that we were completely astounded to discover. But in amongst the estate holdings were autobiographical, I won't say writings, because she actually she spoke her autobiography to a friend in later life because her eyesight had failed so badly, and it was transcribed by him. And they're an amazing insight into her practice and her life. Certainly one of the things that came through very strongly, a number of her friends are still living, and they talk about her character. So there's that really problematic term, difficult woman, is used over and over again in relation to Marion. And actually, when we looked through the existing information that was written on her, a lot of this by friends and male friends at that, in the local press, they trotted out this pattern every time. You know, she was a character, she was a difficult woman, she didn't get on with many people. Actually, what we started to realise was that she had an incredible sense of spirit and self-belief, and she was passionate about pursuing art despite the constraints she faced. So in the late 1920s, 1928, her father died, and the burden of care for her ageing mother increasingly fell on Marion. She was an only child. And her mother didn't die until 1958, so you can see straight away that was a huge undertaking for her. She lived with her mother at her childhood home on Otter Street in Derby throughout. And certainly in her autobiographical writings, she talks about feeling trapped in Derby, partly because of the care for her mother, but the need as well to pursue a day job. And as Julie said, you know, she was a teacher throughout, and she felt that she had to keep bringing a wage in. And there's a brilliant line in her autobiographical writings in which she talks about bunking off school as a teacher to go to exhibitions in London to try and develop her art and her own practice. So straight away you get this insight into this woman. I mean, she's absolutely fascinating. I say she's very strongly self-minded and very spirited. But yeah, that sense of feeling trapped in Derby comes through again and again very strongly. It's incredibly sad, actually, particularly during the war years, when, of course, being in a reserved occupation, she couldn't help contribute to war work, and then she felt very disappointed about that. She says, I knew all of the privations of the war years and none of the excitement, is how she put it. Oh, right. Yeah, I think that sums it up quite well. And so I think naturally her work, was sort of starting to form in a very distinct and unique sort of vacuum that she was living in. And some of that has a local resonance, but some of it doesn't. But yes,
so there's that kind of local and like international aspect, and it's then interesting that you said she felt trapped in Derby, and then so when she could be free, and then she retired to France, and and it really disappoints me, the language used, and that's really interesting, isn't it? The language used in the 20th century to describe women, and the same qualities of a man would be celebrated, type of thing, and that's kind of difficult to hear. But it kind of then relates to the next point I want to ask about. So men in the 20th century, we know, were often the gatekeepers of art establishments. It was very much a man's world. And I just caught the Paula Rego documentary, which was re-shown on television a couple of weeks ago, and she spoke about having to act like a man, and maybe that kind of maybe just struck a chord just now with what you were saying about Marion. But she was a Derby surrealist, and she kind of, was she not taken as seriously as a woman surrealist in art history terms? Was as you said, she was a caregiver as well, and women weren't given exhibitions. Men were more reliable and taken more seriously, and especially in terms of the surrealists. Do you think that impacted then her legacy, why she was sort of forgotten, or because she was only proactive in exhibiting and being like a man at the time and showing, selling?
She was very active, and quite early on she was showing her work in London. So she took an armful of paintings down to the Stafford Gallery and said, "Can you sell these?" And then sort of almost, she talked about almost falling over when the gallery owner said, "Yeah, we can sell those, we'll have the lot," and sold them really quickly. So she straight away, okay, basically I've got to paint some more stuff, and then went home and dutifully did that. She was championed as well by Jack Bilbo in his Modern Art Gallery in London, and in fact in his book The Moderns of 1945 he talks about Marion and reproduces one of her paintings. We've got a painting from our collection in among the slides of one of her paper ladies called Alter Ego, and it was this painting. There she is. It's this painting that he references and reproduces in the book, and he talks about her as being an important contemporary artist, and others besides. So she's in there in this kind of pantheon of modern artists. The interesting thing is that, and I was trying to chew this over and wondering sort of when things changed for her. And I think it's during the war, when Jack Bilbo's gallery closed and he moved to Weybridge. Stafford Gallery went bankrupt, so she no longer had that commercial outlet in London. And she continues to exhibit, but in the East Midlands, particularly at the Midland Gallery in Nottingham, with whom she had a lot of close connections and friends. And at Derby, of course, as well, and stayed in with the Women's Art Club in Derby, who exhibited regularly. So I think she did what she could, but that there's a definite kind of cut-off period in her work around the war years.
I think that's really interesting for two reasons. One, I think it's really important to recognise, I guess, the practical side of things, the devastating effect that the war had on the art industry, that meant that there was suddenly a complete loss of opportunity for artists to make money from being artists during that period, unless they were involved in the War Artists Advisory Committee, which I'm assuming she wasn't from that. And when we look at the War Artists Advisory Committee, there were some women commissioned, but obviously disproportionately it was men being commissioned for that. The government funded scheme for promoting arts through the war period in the 40s. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, is when surrealism comes to be written about in art history books, in criticism, when it is theorised in the 20s and 30s, women's role in surrealism is quite equivocal, because although there were a large number of practicing female surrealist artists who are incredibly significant, a lot of the theories about surrealism have women as muses rather than as practitioners. So despite the fact we have Lee Miller, despite the fact that we have Mary Adams, despite the fact we have Eileen Agar, the sort of the space for women within surrealism as a theory, as a style, was more towards them being muses. So they don't fit that easily in that kind of very patriarchal narrative of the style.
I think that's really interesting, because it reflects something that is said of Marion quite often. Her work is often compared to the work of Dali and Margaret, rather than on its own merits. So, this is kind of how it's been defined in relation to these other great male names in surrealism. She was never a member of any organised surrealist group, but her background, initially at least, was as a modern languages teacher, and she was fluent in French. And one of the questions that we've asked, and we've not been able to get to the bottom of this, is how much of the original material of surrealist writing she had access to and could understand. So she travelled in Europe with Art College in the 1930s, and she was certainly familiar with the writings of the Comte de Lautréamont. So, there's a question about how much original material she had actually might have had access to, and was probably very well read.
And had access to in Derby.
Yes.
Because as I've recently found out, when we look back at old exhibition catalogues from Derby from the 20s and 30s, there are sometimes lists of new art library books that have been bought by Derby County Council in this period. So we can go back and look at, 1930 whatever, and see what new art books were bought, and think about what might have been there when she was in the city as well, which is really fascinating.
So did you make, I mean, how did you survive financially? Did you just do something in work?
Through teaching, that was her bread and butter, throughout.
That's also the other thing, isn't it? The moms actually earning money. That's always a problem.
Yes. Yeah, she did feel that was a constraint on her. She felt frustrated that she could only work at weekends. And the great tragedy about Marion, which I find incredibly sad, is that she retires. And she has about 10 years where she's free to work, do her own thing. She's independent, free spirit. She gets her second home in France, immerses herself there in her art. And within the space of 10 years, she's brought down by degenerative disorder, and she's no longer able. Well, she talks about sort of feeling her way of canvas. She starts to paint increasingly large canvases. In a slightly more abstract style, and that was her way of trying to get through, but eventually she had to give up, and she was 96 when she died. So there was this huge period where she had to live with this intense frustration. It's really tragic.
That's very sad.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just to follow up on that, you Jane, were talking about the artist that you've discovered who was in the Amazon.
Oh yeah.
And did she make money off of that? I'll bring up the photo in a sec, or is that personal, or did she?
I mean, she wasn't. So this is an artist called Margaret Me, who is quite interesting because she's working in the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, but in a very almost slightly separate from the art world, because she's working in kind of botanical studies, which are not really being influenced, I suppose, by the kind of art historical kind of interests and styles that are prevalent in that period. She's kind of working, looking at kind of an older tradition of producing artworks. But she's amazing. She finds it very difficult to find work in Britain for her artwork. And she has family in South America. So she goes off, she packs up her bags with her husband and goes off to South America, where she starts having these amazing journeys through the Amazon, recording and drawing lots of predominantly flowers and botanical, making botanical illustrations and plants. I don't know how much money she made out of botanical illustrations, because they're obviously a very specific scientific thing. You're not kind of going to sell them in an art gallery. After she died, she, despite having these incredible adventures in the Amazon, where she basically went along the river pretty much on her own, had various scrapes. She always carried a pistol with her, and kind of fended people off when they came into her tent unannounced and things. But she then died in a car crash in Leicester, which is such a kind of contrasting death to her life. But there was then a trust set up at the Royal Botanical Gardens of Kew, and there was a retrospective exhibition of her work after her death. But I think that was one of only a handful of kind of exhibitions of her work, and the most significant exhibition that occurred after her death. And it's only really now that her work is being appreciated for what it can provide kind of in terms of conservation and ecological science, because she's actually ended up painting many of these plants that have now been destroyed through deforestation. So her artwork provides a kind of really rare scientific record of where some of these plants were. But she does fall in quite an interesting space, because I think if you can see so hers is the picture on the right of it's too far away, I can't remember what plant it is.
Flowering in the Rio Negro forest in Amazonas. painted in 1979.
Thank you very much. So her work kind of falls between art and science, because it's not a traditional kind of botanical study that just shows a picture of the plant and the seed and the leaf. It's properly situated in the place in which it's growing, and they're quite big, these works. They're kind of not little scientific illustrations. So she's a very interesting artist, and we're having one of her works on show in this exhibition that we're doing in Leamington in January, from lent from the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. And that exhibition is going to explore, from kind of basically 1700 to the present day, the unique relationship that women have had with the subject matter of flowers. And in many ways, something that, despite covering 3 centuries, hasn't changed hugely. This idea that kind of floral subjects, although painted a lot by male artists and female artists, are still often seen as a kind of particularly feminine subject. And that kind of starts in the 18th and 19th centuries, where I suppose this kind of links into what we started talking about, this idea that flowers are very accessible and suitable subject for women to draw, because you don't have to really go out and meet anybody to actually do flowers. And women obviously were not able to kind of sketch nudes or really have access to art schools, but it continues up into the present day. So I've just been reading a book about Dod Proctor, who was an artist who was actually mainly known for her figure studies and kind of nudes, and her flower paintings aren't very well known. And I kind of wonder if it is because it was seen as such a traditional and feminine subject, and not really something that was necessarily in keeping with what's happening kind of during the 20th century and the kind of what's popular, particularly in modern art. But in the book that I was reading, which was only published in 2005, so not particularly long ago, but it kept talking about how she was particularly good at painting flowers because of her feminine sensibility. And it was just it just felt very strange, because it was only published 15 years ago. But you would never have something like that written about a male artist, and plenty of male artists painted flowers. So it's not like you can't paint good flowers unless you have this kind of particularly romantic spirit, and you kind of really are, connecting with the flowers. I mean, what they're really saying is that she painted in quite kind of an impressionistic kind of style, very atmospheric. She wasn't necessarily kind of creating a botanical image, but yeah, it's still referred to as kind of romantic, sensitive, this sensitive conversation. So it's something that you would expect when discussing female depictions of flowers, maybe in the Victorian times, but it's actually something that's still very much present in our historical criticism in the modern day.
Using that as a justification to value those pictures less than you value her figurative work. We have the same thing with Vanessa Bell.
Yeah.
And Vanessa Bell's later work, later on in her life, into the 50s and 60s, where she paints, flowers. And they are in no way considered interesting to any kind of extent as her figurative or abstract work.
It's the same also with Winifred Nicholson. That Winifred Nicholson's works are popular and sell well throughout her life, but she's only kind of really been seen as a significant modern artist kind of in the last couple of decades. And it's kind of, people have speculated that actually it's because she was really a colorist. She was fascinated by the use of color, and lots of people have said that, really actually Ben Nicholson owed it all to Winifred Nicholson. But because she uses flowers as a vehicle to explore colour, and it's a very traditional medium that is associated with women, and she often just, through most of her life, she had a very uniform style. She just did lots and lots and lots of pictures of flowers, that people have found that kind of repetitive traditional subject something to actually kind of slightly count against her, rather than the fact that each of these works is a really exciting exploration of colour. And she also, unlike quite a lot of women, Dod Proctor didn't really write at all about why she painted the way she did. She didn't really comment about conception. Winifred Nicholson wrote articles about looking at colour and how colour works, and in an artistic and a scientific way, looking kind of through prisms and things. But yet that kind of, because of what she paints, it slightly kind of counts against her as this kind of female subject.
I think that's a really interesting point about who is speaking about this work, right? Everyone's talked so far about the characterization of women artists. Sort of, Marion, you were mentioning that idea of the characterization of like the woman artist's mother and how that's very problematic, and the idea of the difficult woman, the idea of the kind of feminine woman, extra sensitive, paints flowers. And I think, the question needs to be asked is, where are these ideas coming from? And if we look at, the criticism, we do see women writing about art, but, it's perhaps rare to have women artists writing about their own work and then that writing being accessible to us. So Marion Adams feels very unusual as someone who's been able to articulate using words and language about her own practice in her lifetime. And when I went down to the galleries with some of you in the room, we were talking about, this idea of, not having Yasmin David's kind of sort of testimony about her own practice, so trying to have to piece stuff together. And I mentioned, we were talking about characterization, and I mentioned Vanessa Bell being characterized as being kind of very quiet and didn't write about her work. And I said that her sister called her mute as a mackerel. She doesn't speak. And I mentioned Sylvia Goss, another 20th century British female artist who was talked of as being always quiet and in the corner and not speaking to anyone, even though she was like a member of the London group and on the exhibition committee for the London group. I don't know how you quite sit quietly in the corner whilst organising exhibitions for the London group, but apparently it happened, so is that something that we're seeing here as well?
Yeah, the idea of the kind of the female artist as shy and modest. I think perhaps that kind of links back into what we were talking about at the beginning as well about, and it's something that we were talking about, Julie and the group, when we were looking at the Yasmin David exhibition, is this idea as to how much when you come out in as a public artist who is, actively showing your work, to what extent, unlike male artists, your personal life and your private life is used as a lens through which to see your work, and to what extent, therefore, women have been reluctant to show their work publicly because they don't want to necessarily be seen through that lens. I mean, Vanessa Bell, despite being described as muted and mackerel, is often mainly seen through the lens of the Bloomsbury Group and her relationship with Duncan Grant, which is seen as kind of primary interest, and then her work is kind of perhaps kind of seen through that lens, or not really seen kind of just on its own as part of what's happening in the art world. I think that's something that's really interesting. I wanted to actually say something a bit earlier, not related to the Farrow exhibition, but Modern Mercia, which is this art design exhibition we've got on at Leamington at the moment. We have a work by an artist called Alma Ramsey Hosking, who is not very well known at all. She exhibited throughout her life, but only regionally, only really kind of in Stratford and in Coventry. And her daughter wrote a preface to our exhibition catalogue, which I think is really nice. And almost like Cleo, her daughter has been very involved in highlighting kind of the work that she produced. She produced a very stylistically wide work. So on the left here, that's a very kind of faux medieval Sir Guy and the Dumb Cow for a public commission for Coventry. But then on the right, you've got a very kind of Henry Moore-ish marble sculpture from 1980. And she studied under Henry Moore. But in the preface of the exhibition catalogue, her daughter says that during the kind of when she was at art school, so I think that was in the kind of 30s, there were two types, or rather in the 50s, going up to the 50s, she kind of says there's two types of artists. There were artists who were kind of out and who had access to studios and who were able to kind of work also in kind of new styles, because they were also very physical, so particularly kind of new sculptural styles. And she says that type of artist was predominantly men. And then there were the quiet artists who were women who, because of their domestic commitments, weren't able to go out, weren't able to have access to studios. And she says that her mother was kind of in that second group. She predominantly had to raise her children, and didn't have a studio. She made the actual real sculpture for Sgar and the Dun Cow in her living room, bringing buckets of water through with concrete to make it. But she also said that in art schools, there were male and female students, but the female students were mainly seen as a pool from which to select your wife, rather than being kind of, serious artists. So I think you've got all of that baggage kind of that female artists are kind of having to wade through to even just kind of make work, and that must inherently shape the way in which you then either display or don't display your work and what you kind of produce.
I mean, thinking about that sort of, we're talking here about, I guess, more sort of structural issues in society now, aren't we? And I wondered whether, in addition to speaking about gender, we could also maybe touch on class. Because I wonder how much class also plays a role in this, in terms of the importance of having a regular wage into the house, and what women were and were not able to access. So thinking about things like, if you needed to bring a regular wage into the house, if there was not family money there. Earlier on in the 20th century, in certain parts of the country, there'll be rules where once you become married, you can't teach in art schools. And if you're an artist, maybe a lot of your income might have come from your work as a teacher in an art college. And once you marry, you're not able to do that. Whereas if you have private money behind you, family money behind you, supporting you, you don't maybe have that question of can't I marry? How much will this impact on my ability to create work? Obviously, there's other questions then come into play about, time spent being a stay-at-home mother and raising children and how much that's going to impact on you. But, there's that additional question of the need to bring money in, how marriage is going to impact that. And I think the other thing is space. If you are from a working class background, you don't necessarily have a studio room. I didn't grow up with a studio room in my house. So that's another issue. And, there's some amazing photos of, you look at Barbara Hepworth, with the amazing studio space she was able to keep hold of. And I think someone mentioned here that, she was able to, have her children in nursery and have childcare available. Whereas if you are from a working class background or you're living a working class lifestyle, that's not going to be open to you.
I wonder if any of the works that Naomi's has in the collection, if there might be more variety there than what we're talking about in terms of background.
Yeah, Naomi, what do you think?
What was the end part of that question? I just didn't quite catch it, sorry.
Sorry, Naomi. So we're wondering whether any of the works in your collection, whether sort of more recently moving to contemporary times, there's something to say about class and, how that might impact on women's ability to produce work and be commercial with their work.
Yeah, well, I know that Rose Wiley was mentioned earlier. She's by no means a working class artist, but I think the idea of the sort of being constrained to the domestic space definitely does apply to her. She, as was mentioned earlier, is married before he died to another artist, Roy Oxlade, and his career very much took precedence over hers, and she devoted herself to raising their family and being a caregiver and looking after their home. And so, but their house in Kent, which doubles for her as her home and studio, is absolutely covered in her canvases. She painted on all surfaces, and all of the walls are covered in her often quite large scale paintings. So, for example, the work that we have in the collection, which is called Billy Piper, a combo painting, was hanging in her kitchen for a very long time until we acquired it a few years ago. And it's a really, well, I absolutely love her style, the sort of anarchic side to it. She draws on so many different sources, but the story behind this particular work is that she painted it to mark her daughter's wedding, and it depicted her daughter with a wedding marquee, and she was wearing a big white dress. And then 20 years later, she came back to the work having seen a photograph of Billy Piper, the actor, in The Observer, and she decided to turn it into a painting about Billy Piper. So she made the wedding marquee into a dress for Billy, and then wrote the words Billy Piper over it, and she's in this sort of fantastic pose where she's sort of posing like that. But to return to the idea of class, our current temporary exhibition is on the artist Maud Salter, who was quite a prominent member of the British Black Art movement in the 1980s. and was the partner, both romantic and artistic, of Lubena Hamid for a couple of decades. And she sadly passed away in 2008 at the age of only 47. But it's something that she wrote about a lot, the fact that she didn't have access to funding, either through sort of personal wealth or from public funds, which just people weren't interested in work by Black artists at that time. And so she and Lubena Hamid spoke about this a lot in talks that they gave as well. And so a lot of their publications, she also worked as an editor and produced this publication called Passion, Black Women's Creativity, where she had contributions from various different Black artists and writers and activists. And it was a real struggle for her to even publish it and put it together. And the exhibition that we have is on a series that she did in 1989, where she posed various female women in her kind of network, working in different art forms, as the 9 Greek muses. And they're absolutely beautiful photographs, very large scale, using a technology that's now completely defunct, and even then was very rare. So they're incredibly sort of fragile and rare artworks, and they're in these very ornate gilt frames, which are sort of throwing up classical painting and the kind of ostentation that's normally associated with it. So definitely ideas of class and who has access to making work and being in artworks is something that she was very, very interested in.
I'll show you some of those works in a bit. I've got some images actually. At least one of those works is in, there's a version of it in BMAG in Birmingham Museum and Gallery, which sometimes gets displayed. But interestingly, alongside those works, she also wrote monologues for the women who were featured in the paintings. Because Maud Salter started off as a spoken word artist, as a poet, and then moved into producing visual art as well, and text comes into a lot of her works. And I think it's really interesting that, you know, she's exercising that right to speak as a woman, as a female creative practitioner, and she's giving voice to the women that she's representing in her artwork as well. It's very, very interesting work.
Yeah, and we really wanted to emphasize the sort of poetic side of it as well. So we've printed those stream of consciousness prose poems, displayed them next to the portraits, which I think really brings to life the works. And we've also got one of the sitters coming to be on a panel discussion with us, because we wanted to give voice to those women. So yeah.
When's that on until, Naomi?
So it just opened last week and it's on until 2nd of January. So if any of you are in Cambridge, then definitely do come and see it.
That sounds amazing. Thank you.
Yes, so much topics for food for thought and discussion. Yes, everything, the muses, we've got lots of elements of that in our collection, with obviously Kitty giving up her practice to be Freud's muse, and Isabel, and this idea of subject matter, and kind of what is feminine subject matter. But Sophie, I wanted to ask you, because I was really interested in your essay that you did for the exhibition, and in terms of the notion of landscape and gender. Do you want to say a little bit about that in terms of the arts you've been exploring?
Yeah, definitely. So when Julie and I started talking about this exhibition, the first thing, you know, that I was thinking of course, was landscape representation as a landscape. Of course, when we went down to the gallery space, you know, that was mostly what I was talking about. And the way in which Yasmin David's paintings are a very personal response to the landscape, you know, that they are not kind of so-called objective records of the sort of topography of the landscape, but actually kind of expressions of her sort of personal feeling within the landscape, sort of accumulated over a long period of time of being in that place. And it connected for me to some of the art historical writing about gender and landscape. And we've talked a lot so far about characterization of women and how they're characterized in art criticism and writing. We've talked a lot about the structural issues that that women artists have faced that have affected their practice, you know, in terms of, you know, teaching, economy, you know, being pigeonholed by the subject matter they focus on. But when we turn to think about, you know, how art history has recorded practices, and when we come back to this question of subject matter, there's so much gendering that traditionally went on art historical scholarship, and landscape is a really, really fascinating subject to explore in terms of gender. So there's a book by Anna Robbins and a colleague from about 15 years ago that looks at landscape and gender specifically. And one of the things they talk about is how landscape traditionally has been portrayed as a very masculine subject, because the landscape itself is often feminized. So those people recording the landscape are adopting a kind of masculine position. So the metaphor, think about the metaphors we use for landscape as kind of, you know, conquering landscape, or sort of, you know, territory to be sort of controlled or husbanded, or kind of, husbandry, yeah, basically, you know, the idea of the pioneer setting out into the landscape. Well, that's, you know, the male pioneer, the explorer, the adventurer, the farmer, and the landscape itself is a kind of feminine thing that's there to be molded and shaped and tamed, basically. And these sorts of metaphors that we see across all areas of creative practice. Because of course that male-female dynamic, you know, does not fit it. So I was really fascinated by Yasmin David's work as a kind of expression of, you know, what it's like being a woman in the landscape, where we're not seeing this idea of, you know, the gendered power dynamic between the kind of colonizer, with all the kind of connotations that comes with that, and the sort of controlled landscape. And actually thinking how little scholarship there is on women's landscape painting. There are a couple of exceptions. Maybe someone like Joan Erdley has been attended to quite a lot in more recent scholarship. But there's also a lot of women who were working in landscape tradition in the interwar and post-war period. But when we think about British art in that period, I think we tend to go for the men. You know, we might think about Paul Nash, Peter Lanyon, Patrick Heron, Ivor Hitchens, Graham Sutherland, you know, the list goes on. And we might not, other than maybe mentioning, say, Wilhelmina Barnes Graham and Joan Erdley, who I think are a little bit better known, we might struggle to mention people like, you know, Gillian Ayres, Sheila Fell, Sandra Blow to a certain extent, Margaret Mellis, because they don't fit in that narrative of the man goes out into the landscape and has that experience and paints what he sees and tames the wildness or captures the wildness in his art. So I think looking at Yasmin David's work provides a really, really useful prompt for us, a kind of inspiration for us to actually start thinking outside of that sort of stereotyped, quite traditional relationship that is really kind of rooted in a previous generation of scholarship, and start to rethink maybe how we can kind of conceptualize landscape from a different perspective. I think Yasmin David's work is a kind of good inspiration for us to do that with. Yeah.
Okay. Just looking at the time, so it's 4 now, but I'd really like to involve the audience as well in the conversation. So I wonder if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share, or questions in relation to any of the specialities of the panel, or would anyone like to kick us off?
I was just thinking about the thing about class. My mother was also a painter, but she also had her own, she has a private income. She had 5 children, so and she said when we went to school, so she did have her own studio and she could afford to buy her materials. And I think she didn't have to struggle to paint. I mean, she did have some exhibitions, but she didn't have to paint to live. She painted because she wanted to, but in terms of actually being able to use, you know, having to bring money home to keep us all alive.
Pretty impressive having 5 children though. did she continuously paint, or was it later in life, or? Yeah, and that is similar to Yasmin. I mean, she had this space, isn't it? Yeah, the affinity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are different kinds of paint as well. Abstract, not abstract, but the stills works like this, like a couple of bottles, they're very, very white. They're very tame from the similar thing, not
having the luxury and the space and the time. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, just in terms of like the Freelance Foundation research that I mentioned and Hetty Judah, and it's something that we're going to be exploring with the next exhibitions that I'm working on, which is around themes in our new 2020 collection, which we did a call out earlier in the year for works by West Midlands artists who've responded to the themes of the past 12 months and during the pandemic. And it's themes like Brexit and Black Lives Matter, but also COVID and the effect on the pandemic. And during the pandemic, we offered some stay-at-home residencies, and artist Faye Claridge chose to look with artists who were having to homeschool at the same time and be at home with their children, and asked a selection of artists to work with their child, get them to pick an artwork of their parents that they liked and respond to it. And this kind of first time that they'd responded to their parents' work and having to be alone at home and this homeschooling and managing the work. And so there's a lot of works in that collection, or several, I should say, it's a small collection that relate to these kind of themes that we're going to be further exploring. And one of the artists, Joanne Masding, is got work in My Kids Could Have Done That. I don't know if you've seen the exhibition that's just open in Bath at the Holborn. I can't wait to kind of go and see that. That the curators are just working with his 5-year-old daughter and showing works by that produced during lockdown by the child and the parent. And so it's definitely a hot kind of current topic because of all this research and the idea of motherhood and space for women to find to work. So that's definitely things that we're going to be discussing further in the future. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions or queries or ideas?
I mean, just from a personal perspective, it was fascinating listening to the talk about the characterization and what you were talking about Marion, because the artist I study, when you were saying difficult woman, I was like, this is exactly what was written about the artist. Her name is Mary Swansea. Not many people outside of Ireland know her. But yes, difficult woman, formidable woman, old dragon. Yeah, that one was particularly, I mean, I wouldn't mind being called an old dragon, to be honest. There's something quite fierce about that. Very Anglo-Protestant, Anglo-Irish Protestant upper class lady, Victorian lady. But yes, that sense of being, and what you were saying about it being strong in her self-belief, and then being people who are writing about her, I just wanted to say, yes, it is a thing.
Yeah, how do we change the narratives and the language, the historical language that kind of separates men and women, so that same terminology is positive for men and they can have that, as you were saying, their art and life is separate, whereas for women it's inextricably kind of entwined in who they dated or which artists they knew kind of were married to. And yeah, how do we kind of change those narratives?
And the same also, I think, earlier, the very beginning, when Naomi was talking about Barbara Hepworth, and she had 3 children, but she sent them away to be cared for. And when you look at a kind of the way that would be seen now is that, that there was something cruel about that she sent her children away to focus on her artwork. But that's not, you would never have that for a male artist. You would never say, he didn't raise his children, he focused on his art. And so kind of with the motherhood question, or the personal relationships kind of question, it's a double-edged sword, because either they've actively chosen not to have children, or triple-edged sword, or they've chosen to have children but not raise them, or they've had children, and then that's prevented the way they've worked. It's kind of, there's no win-win situation. It's kind of whichever way they're viewed at, it's either contrary, it's somehow contrary to the way that women should be perceived.
I just as a mother myself, somebody who changed careers when I had my child, I did wonder that if some of the female artists who decided not to actually did it because they genuinely thought they couldn't be good at both, because that's certainly what went through my head. I was a teacher for 12 years and I was acting head when I became pregnant with my son, and I realised that doing a job where I was in work at 8 o'clock in the morning and often didn't leave till 6 o'clock and then brought boxes home with me, I wasn't going to have a lot of time for my child, and I made that decision myself to do something that I could do from home, so I could get him to school in the morning and I'd be the one picking him up, and I'd be the one in school holidays, and I'd be the one being sick. But I made that decision consciously and I've never regretted it. But certainly the lockdown, working from home became completely different, because what I found was that my son needed my laptop, which I work on because I now work as a freelance writer. He needed that. So my work was suddenly being done sometimes at midnight, at the weekends, on a Sunday. And I am wondering if, when we start to see some of the art that will emerge from lockdown, from female painters and artists, whether we're going to see a lot of their anger and tiredness in this work, because that's certainly how I felt, trying to balance the two. And I think we probably will see that.
Yeah, definitely. But it just is frustrating, you think, in this day and age, that we're still having these discussions, that these studies are coming out and these experiences are kind of repeating, and how do we break that kind of cycle?
I wonder if it's by trying to break this, what seems to, in my mind, a permanent link between womanhood and motherhood, that they are the same thing, and that they can be, absolutely, and that can be the choice, but it can also be the choice not to. But it seems like there's an expectation that if you are in womanhood, you will of course end up on one side or the other of motherhood, and that's not necessarily
or caring.
Yeah, and that's not always the case.
And there's already been studies that said that the lockdown was certainly far worse in terms of
impact on women.
Did that balancing act than it was for men. I'm married, but my husband was only off for 6 weeks, and then because he was in the building trade, he went back anyway. But my son was still at home. He was still at home for another couple of months, and obviously he needed the help and all the rest of it. So that fell onto me, and I think that's true of a lot of women, but particularly if you worked from home in the first place, because you were already there.
Yeah,
and despite the fact that it's like, oh no, I'm not really here because I'm here working. I've still got to do that, I've still got to bring the money in, etc., etc. It's still, but you're there, you don't have to actually leave the house in the morning or come back or commute or any of those things.
It's that blurring of boundaries, isn't it, where the home is also the workplace and the workplace is also the home, and what is your professional identity and what is your personal identity, and maybe with women those things are so much more entangled.
Wait, sorry.
Well, it just bringing you back to Yasmin David, that she was able to have that division.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
That having that, the opinion, well, obviously having the privilege to have that extra space creates that division. That's very interesting.
As much if she was well known and she got to do exhibitions here, there, and everywhere, and travel around the country and work and promote her work and stuff. And maybe that's some element of why she decided not to. Because at the end of the day, it's far more difficult to balance that if you're trying to balance the two things and have your personal family life. Particularly with that notorious her family was.
But also how she said that her children weren't allowed to go into her studio space, which I think is,
which was the same as Paula Regal.
This idea that once she's in there, she is in artist mode, she is not in mother mode or caring mode, and almost in some ways that the idea that even if her children just went in there, it would be somehow kind of too much of a blurring of the boundaries kind of in her headspace as well. So this idea that she worked to keep it completely separate is really interesting.
I wish we had Cleo here to give us an insight on that.
I'm interested in kind of things that we've alluded to in terms of like sexist language and the kind of, I guess, women are always referred to an emotional language and virtues a weaker sex, and that by somehow, you know, by extension, emotions are kind of, you're weak if you show emotion. And I just think that there's something that inherently connects in terms of that care and motherhood issues, that they can't be separated. That's why, yeah, I don't understand Barbara Hepworth and Kathleen Garman and Lorna. Like, I feel like they had these really difficult relationships, the mothers and the daughters, and they maybe felt very abandoned. I mean, Lorna would go off with reeking in Chanel No. 5 to London and leaving the children, and they were affluent and had the support mechanisms there. But often it's kind of that kind of emotional ties that seem to be easier for men to separate from the work. Maybe what would you think? I suppose it relates to subject matter as well, and that kind of feminine art that you kind of alluded to as well.
Yeah, I think you definitely get, I mean, women have historically throughout all time been seen as the kind of more emotional, more kind of delicate,
and these things are seen as negative,
and well, it's seen as negative only in some circumstances. I don't think it's seen as negative for many reasons, you know, childcare being one of them, then seen as kind of emotional when it's put in supposedly the wrong context, and that perhaps it could then be seen as in terms of context also in artistic styles, that, you know, emotion is very appropriate for I'm thinking now kind of before the modern period, but kind of, you know, Victorian ideas of the hierarchies of genres, the kind of emotion being acceptable for flower painting, but not necessarily for history painting. So kind of this, I think that, but I think also that there are lots of modern artists, you know, kind of, I keep going back to Barbara Hepworth now, even though I have no specialist kind of claim on her, but who kind of move away from that, and perhaps maybe you're trying to kind of not necessarily always being associated with that.
Well, I guess it's like behaving like a man. That's what's often kind of said. Well, maybe Marion as well.
I was just going to say quickly, I think it depends on what we're talking about when we talk about emotion, because there'll be some emotions that will be kind of characterized within that modern period as being, you know, the sort of emotions that men might display that would be acceptable. I mean, certainly surrealism, Marianne Abnam's, you know, style, that was a lot about exploring psychology and everyone's inner lives, and, you know, that was something that men were doing, and that could be considered to some extent. Yeah, I suppose so, psychoanalytically, and that could be seen as an exploration of emotion. And we think about Epstein's generation and, you know, the vorticists who he was sort of contemporary with before the First World War. They were incredibly emotive in what they were doing, but in a kind of very sort of virile, kind of aggressive,
it's not really emotion, it's kind of sensibility. Perhaps.
It's sensibility, yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Right. Children, or
they do. They both do.
Quite successful in terms of
they're very interesting, and almost kind of the exceptions to what we are saying.
Slightly later generation, but yeah, slightly later generation, yeah.
But I think I don't know how class applies in those situations necessarily. In terms of
I guess a lot
ability to pursue the work.
A lot of the women we've talked about here have sort of either grown up or started their careers in the interwar period, and they're sort of coming to maturity in the immediate post-war period, where if we think about, you know, Rachel Whiteread, you know, that's later generation, maybe they're in different sort of circumstances.
Some of them growing up even in the basically as an audience.
Oh gosh, in your case, yes, certainly.
So you know, Winifred Nicholson, I mean, Barbara Hepworth, you've got Deborah Proctor, all kind of growing up in the very early 20th century. So kind of, but then painting all the way through into the kind of 1970s. So you've got their lives experience kind of hugely radical change in terms of gender roles. But they still, you know, have been raised with that original kind of emotional baggage and kind of societal rules that were imposed with them kind of from the Edwardian period. So it's something very hard to kind of break from.
And often a lot of these successful women may have been in partnerships with men and male artists as well and supported. So obviously Winifred and Barbara to some extent with Ben Nicholson, but then more contemporary as well, like Deborah Curtis and Gavin Turk, or Bob and Roberta Smith, and I've forgotten his wife's name. But yeah. Oh, lovely. Yeah. Yeah. But I think I'm thinking of contemporary artists that we work with who's kind of they share, you know, it's much more equitable, and they share kind of childcare and support each other. So that's a kind of different way of I guess working. Yeah. So yes, it's not all doom and gloom, and yeah. Yeah.
Just that is your sole work, meaning earning money. I think you have to work very hard.
It's also needs for societal shifts in terms of the places where you're expected to kind of go out beyond the studio, and their kind of to what extent they accept kind of bringing children along as being something that is kind of seen as unprofessional, and actually there needs to be those structural changes in the places that you go to, that actually if you go to a conference and you have a baby strapped to your chest, there's nothing actually wrong with that. You know, you can walk around and do your job perfectly acceptably, but somehow that's seen as kind of unprofessional because you're bringing your home life into your work life. But actually, you know, as we've been discussing, particularly for female artists, historically it's been something where the two are together. So it's kind of also the need for societal change.
Pandemic might have changed that with Zoom calls and kiddies popping up, and because that's happened to, you know, men and women. We've seen it on the telly, and
yes, exactly. That's been a bit of a leveler, and in terms of access as well, the digital technology will help loads with that. Well, I just want to kind of, we'll be finishing up in a few minutes, so I just want to really thank the panel very much, and Naomi as well. Thank you. I know you're busy and about to head off as well, so thank you so much for joining and for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you. I wish I could be there in person, but
yes, do come and visit us soon whenever you get freed up and get a chance. Naomi, thank you so much, and good luck with the rest of your year.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.